Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jubilee, Freedom, and Shalom podcast. I'm here with Nate as usual, and we are starting a new season. If you listen to our intro trailer, season 2 opener catch-up episode, we don't have a title for it yet, but if that's what it is called, then that would be pretty awesome. You know that we're jumping in right now to a conversation, some reflections, some questions to ask about a recent podcast that has come out called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
By Christianity Today.
Yes, by Christianity Today. You should look it up and listen to it. It's very interesting. We're going to do some reflecting on what happens in those episodes, and we will try our best to make it clear as to what we're talking about, but our reflections will deviate from what they talk about because they're just doing journalism. They're just reporting on it. And so we wanted to do some more in-depth reflecting on what does this mean for the church and for us, and how does this happen, and some different questions. So all that to say, it probably would be better, definitely would be better for you if you listen to the Mars Hill episode that attaches to our reflections, and you listen to them back to back, put it on 1.5 and just kind of go through it. It'll make a lot more sense. Or if you are familiar with the podcast because you already listened to it, I think you'll do fine in listening to our reflections on it. So we're excited to talk about this. It's got a lot of attention right now, as it had happened a while ago, but just this podcast, some things have come out about Mark Driscoll and the Mars Hill Church. And so we're excited to reflect more deeply about what this looks like and what it means for us and going forward. So this is episode 1, reflections on episode 1 of The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
Right. So what I want to do is, if you haven't listened to it, I just want to read their intro. So what they do at the beginning of every podcast episode is they play a song by King's Kaleidoscope. Is it called Pain in the Beauty We Split? Or
it's called Sticks and Stones.
Sticks and Stones, yeah. And so the song will sing a line, and then they'll throw a quote in behind it, and then it'll sing another line, throw a quote in behind it from the series. And so I just wanted to read some of the quotes they throw in there to kind of tease the next episodes and stuff.
This is audio from interviews with previous members, people who worked with Mark. This is just quotes from Mark's sermons.
Yeah, authors, people reflecting on what happened there, and also from Mark himself. So there's a few quotes from Mark himself. So some of the first couple are from people that are just kind of reflecting and helping process all this stuff. So the first quote is, "Why are we not looking at the deep-seated reasons for this? What happened at Mars Hill?" Mm-hmm. Another person that worked with Mark just came in and said, if you plant a church, he's going to tear it down brick for brick. Okay. And so the next one is, we have a culture of church members who would prefer a narcissist leading the church. Then
that was a reflection just generally on American Christianity.
Yeah. So they say a statistic, I think it's early on, but like it may be in the second or third episode, but where they say, mega churches are technically churches over 2,000 members. I think in the 70s, they said there was only 30 mega churches in America, and now there's like 1,800 or 1,500. And so it's like, what's the deal with that trajectory and what's going on with all that? But the next one is Mark Driscoll screaming, "How dare you? Who in the hell do you think you are?" And you would think that everyone is like, "I can't believe you just said that," but actually everyone cheers afterwards.
Yeah.
And you're like,
that was in a sermon on a Sunday morning.
Sermon on a Sunday morning. Yeah. So then another person reflecting that's not Mark, there's very real chronic trauma that comes from serving within systems like this, talking about churches and mega churches, which, by the way, I had a friend text me last night. He's like, "So I've been watching, some of the stuff you're talking about with Mars Hill and some of the stuff. And I didn't realize like megachurch pastor suicides was like a real thing. Like I didn't realize how many of those there are. I'm like, yeah, it's a really unnatural system. It's a really traumatic experience for a lot
It's
of
not
people.
good for anybody.
And it's not like even the people who are in power, quote unquote, it's corrupting, corroding them.
Yeah.
And you take the fact that a pastor's whole life is wrapped up in it's like their job, it's their income, it's their family, it's their friends, it's their spiritual community. And then the thought of losing all that in one stroke, it may even be their housing where they live.
Right. The only way they can keep up is for it to be everything about who they are.
Yeah.
Like every waking minute has got to be obsessing over that.
And so losing that all at once, I'm sure it can just break some people. So this is another quote from Mark. There's a few guys that if I wasn't going to end up on CNN, I would go Old Testament on them.
Talking about beating them up
or
killing them,
striking them down dead. Yeah. And you'll hear in a future episode, he was referring to some elders that were giving him some pushback on, some accountability, and he ended up, throwing them to the side. So
under the bus.
And then the next one is a person that I think worked with Mark says, a lot of pastors get fired, but Driscoll got fired for being an asshole. And you're like, oh, so it wasn't that he had some scandalous, he cheated on his wife or he stole money from the church.
Money, yeah.
No, it's like just straight up, he was just so mean.
Yeah, he's just a jerk.
That people couldn't handle it. And it was so traumatic for people that people couldn't handle it anymore. And then you get another Mark quote just saying, "Who do you think you are?" And everyone's just cheering. And because he's just calling out basically young males, that he's calling them lazy and you need to get off your butt and get out of your mom's basement and all this kind of like really aggressive stuff towards young males, and just screaming, "How dare you? Who the hell do you think you are?" So me and Rachel, when we've been at home the other night, for instance, like she had planned to cook one thing and ended up doing some other things. So she texted me before. It's like, "Hey, I changed the menu." I was like, "Oh." And I just responded with, "How dare you? Who the hell do you think you are?" And so now that's been like our running joke. Like every time we're, plans change, like, "Actually, I'm going to be 15 minutes. Who do you think you are?" So it's been a pretty funny thing, but I'm sure the people who that was being said to, and those are the things he said out loud in public in his sermons. So I cannot imagine what staff meetings looked like, what elders meetings looked like behind closed doors when something not good was going on. That must have been and there is an episode where he does pull aside a lot of the males at the church aside to their gymnasium, just lambast them for like 2 hours straight. Mm-hmm. And they had a church website that had a blog, what am I talking about? A forum on it.
Yeah.
And he had like a pseudonym where he would go in there and just call people terrible names and stuff and
say like people. Racist things and misogynistic things. And
so that'll come later. But let's start with episode 1. That's the intro. If you've never heard the intro before, and let's just start talking about some of the things that stuck out to us that we wrote down as notes. And so Daniel, I'll give you the first. What did you write down?
So one of the things that comes up often to me in this conversation with Mars Hill and in a lot of areas is Mark was one of the first mega church preachers to have a platform, and we'll talk about this in later episodes. Just the timing of when he was growing in popularity, he was kind of the first to figure out how to use Twitter and how to use the internet for his advantage.
The first, I think it was one of the first preachers to put his sermons out as podcasts.
Online. Yeah.
As people were getting smartphones and being like, "Oh, smartphone." So then when you looked at, hey, are there any sermons out there? You would see Mark Driscoll.
It would only be Mark.
And so he's getting a majority of the traffic. And then in the future, even when other people did it, the algorithm was still pushing his content because the numbers were in his direction.
Right. He's the OG. of that platform. And so it obviously has grown way past that at this point. And he's, it's not really, the algorithm is not really in his favor anymore. But initially it was. And with all of that platform growing, and just some things they bring up in this first episode about Mark and how he carried himself and how he talked and all that. And this will come up later too. The first question that came to my mind is like, we talk about, I forget where it is in the letters of Paul, but there's the passage where he talks about becoming all things to all people so that he may save some, or whatever it is. That the first question that came up to me was like, where does that stop? Where does the becoming all things to all people stop? Like, where do you draw the line? Because Mark was seen as like, he was the guy that from the pulpit, he would cuss a few times. There was like constant talk about like this like corrupted version of masculinity, truthfully, that was really damaging. But just the way that he carried himself, it's like, I am all for a minister trying to meet people where they're at, so I guess the question may be more like, where does that stop? The meeting people where they're at, like, where do you stop? And I think historically we can, or even just generally, we can draw the lines of like, well, obviously don't go with them to a strip club, maybe, like, what I'm saying? Like, we can like have the extreme examples, and some of the stuff for Mark was extreme, but some of it wasn't. Some of it is just the way that he carried himself that allowed for this culture that was actually really attractive to a lot of people. And so then it's like, maybe we should all be like Mark, because like people are actually like listening to him where they wouldn't have listened to another minister. But seeing how, just seeing how he carried himself and how that played out, obviously we don't need to all be like Mark Driscoll in any way, shape, or form. So then it's like, you see what I'm saying? Like, the question then is like, where does meeting people where they're at and being all things to all people, like, how do you draw that line? Where do you draw that line?
Yeah. The a little note that goes along with that is the preachers and sneakers. Like, isn't there like isn't that a hashtag like on Twitter?
It's a whole account called
It's a
Preachers
whole
and
account,
Sneakers.
yeah. And so, but just like behind that, you had a generation behind Mark Driscoll that was, a button-up shirt and khakis, in a blazer. That's what
270,000 followers on Instagram.
Yeah. And so they mentioned sneakers and preachers and sneakers, and it was just like, okay, so I think Mark was one of the first that were just like, I'm not wearing khakis and a button-up. I'm more punk rock than that.
And wear like jeans and graphic tee to preach, whatever.
To preach in. And so, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but then it kind of takes an extreme path of like, you're wearing, $100, multiple $100 shoes, whatever sneakers you're wearing, and the jewelry you're wearing, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, how far do you need to go to impress culture on the fronts that they're impressed by? And I think that goes into music, that goes into our church presentation, the watch, the car, the house you live in. A lot of these cult members, a lot of the documentaries we've been watching recently, it's like, you have to impress people in a really worldly way, apparently, to get them to be interested in Jesus. And I think that's really messed up, because there's the other quote of, what you win them with is what you win them to. Right. It's like, okay, Gwen Shamlin's church, they were really impressed by Gwen's house and her, her clothes, her hair, whatever they were impressed by, but they're like, I want that same success in my life. So They were really brought in by the gospel of success, and that's what they were won to. And if you do that, I think everyone involved is going to drive themselves actually crazy, because pursuing success is slippery.
Yeah.
And it's a God unto itself, and that God asks you to lay down a lot and sacrifice a lot and to bow down a lot of things in your lives to that pursuit. And that is not what I think Jesus is calling us to. And it's not the peace, the shalom, the freedom that he is calling us into. And I don't see where the suffering servant and
falls into that category.
Where he's actually getting into situations that are quite humiliating, that are quite dehumanizing, with the cross, and in other ways, where he's hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors and people that others would think are very, very uncouth, or just not okay to be around.
Yeah.
And so I have a hard time squaring that. And it starts with, preachers and sneakers, but it goes way beyond that, to spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on sound equipment and audio equipment and the people that run that gear. And it's like, okay, what are we winning them this with, and what are we winning them to?
Yeah. Well, and I also think about, like, on a level of kind of like where our churches are at, which are not mega churches, not big sound systems, no private jets. Our preachers aren't wearing like fancy clothes. But I think we need to, in all of this, our hope is to also address, like, if we don't say it out loud, we hope that you listening are kind of assessing your own church and situation. We don't want you to over critique your church, but to think about just the American church in general, and think about the ways that this is infiltrating what we do. And so, like, are we presenting a gospel and representing a gospel as a church that's winning people to Jubilee, freedom, and shalom, that's winning them to suffering servant, like laying your life down for others, loving God? Like, are we winning them to that, or are we winning them to more of like, here, you're now comfortable because you know where you're going to go when you die? Because I think often what we're winning people to, the gospel that we're winning them to, is more of like just a what is it? Oh shoot. There's an acronym for it. The theistic deism. Is it moralistic? Something, I don't know. But it's just like this idea that just being a good person, or just, in our tradition, like just getting baptized, like you've done it.
It's being a good Boy Scout.
Yeah, it's like you're doing the right things, you're going to the right places when you're supposed to.
You're kind, you're courteous,
and like you might truthfully be a good person, like a fun person to be around, loving person, all of that. But then we get frustrated when there's problems in the world that aren't being solved, or we get frustrated when there's people around us that are suffering, and it's like, man, somebody's got to do something about it. And all we've ever taught anybody is we just taught them how to be a good boy and sit in church and like listen well, and then walk away and love people well that are comfortable to love. But like, that's what we're winning them to. It's not we don't even necessarily mean for that to be the case, but I think we need to think about this question too, of like, we feel uncomfortable challenging people so deeply because we might lose people if we really were to challenge them with the reality of like laying your life down for other people and like giving all you have to like grow the kingdom. If you were to really push that, like there would be people that would walk away that would be like, that church is they're intense, man, I can't handle that. I think the fear is that would happen. And I think at Mars Hill, that's the same fear. Is like, if Mark isn't cool, and if Mark isn't everything the culture is, people will go find community somewhere else. And so what you end up, in our context, what you end up winning people to is just like sitting comfortably and being a decent person, and maybe tithing, hopefully.
There's I just saw a new hashtag, like high demand church. And I guess a lot of people getting out of the Latter-day Saints church and saying like it's a high demand religion. And I think what they're trying to say is like it was driving them crazy, like with you need to be here, and you need to do this, you need to do that.
Right.
It's like I do think that Christianity is a high demand religion.
Yeah.
But if it's driving us all insane with the busyness that we do engage with, I don't think we're doing it right. Like it demands a lot. It's this, but there should be this other side where it brings a lot of peace and a lot of rest and a lot of burden being shared with Christ. I don't think it should be like if you're a good Christian, you'll be driving yourself crazy and you're always on the edge of a burnout. I think a lot of our churches are doing that. We're saying if you want to be a good Christian, be busy, 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 and that's not. I don't think that's what Jesus called us into. That's not the yoke that He's asked us to get into with Him.
Right.
And so the brand is what I had next in my notes, just like building a brand for yourself. Like this is our church's brand. This is our minister's brand. You know, someone told Mark he was wearing like puka shell, you know, and he needed to change that because that's not the brand.
Yeah.
And like your chokers aren't cool. You gotta do something else. And Mark was willing to make that change because he wanted the brand to be right and he wanted to grow.
Uniform. Yeah.
And so, I think churches have obsessed about brand way more than they have about the poor. They've accessed, in excess about brand and not about Jesus, not about the vulnerable in our communities. And I think they're completely right to pursue that if your only goal is to grow more people. I 100% agree with them. If you want to grow your church, you better be all about brand because that's what the world needs you to be and that's what they want you to be. And if you really want to grow, that's what you need to be because that's what everyone else is obsessed about. But the thing is, I don't think it's what we should be obsessed about. Right. So that I get like caught in between where I'm like, this is dumb. The whole brand thing is such a waste of time. We're putting so much attention to detail to brand, and we're not obsessing about the things that the gospel cares about.
But if you're trying to get more people, if you're obsessing over how many people walk in the door, then you're doing it right.
You're doing exactly what you should do. Exactly what you do. And the answer would be, well, Nathan, we're supposed to seek and save the lost. You're not saving the lost to bring them into a church that's obsessed about brand. You're taking the lost and giving them a new thing to be lost about.
Yeah.
That's not saving anybody.
No.
You may be getting more people together for your party on Sunday morning and baptizing it all. And saying,
you might even be telling them good stuff.
Yeah, but but you're not. The brand thing kills me. And I know of a person right now who's just at a church long enough until they can build their own personal brand to be able to leave that church, take some people with them and start another church.
Yeah.
They're just in this church in order to gather people to themselves and their own brand and then split from that church and have a core group of people that they can use to build their own little branded empire.
Yeah.
And that bothers me. That bothers me so much, but it also bothers me that they're doing exactly the right thing to accomplish their goal because our society is obsessed with branded things and finding the brand that makes us, feel good or looks good to our eyeballs. And I'm stuck there. Because it's like, okay, I could not be obsessed about brand and our church will probably die because we can't get people to look past the cool factor and see something that's real and genuine because people are blind to that in our culture.
Yeah.
So instead we got to bow down to brand and that idol and branding ourselves or we'll not exist to do any good work. So I don't know, man, but Jesus, that's exactly what he was dealing with in the three temptations, right? It's like if Jesus was the Caesar of Rome, would the world be a better place? And the answer is absolutely. He just wouldn't be Jesus anymore. not the Jesus we know.
Right.
If he was the high priest of the Jerusalem temple, would the world be a better place? Yeah, he just wouldn't be the Jesus that we know.
Yeah.
And if he fed everybody on planet Earth with bread and got all the poor people on his side, would it be a better world if no one was starving anymore? Yeah, it'd be a better world. He just wouldn't be the Jesus that we know and worship, because he chose none of those four things. He chose to be a suffering servant who wasn't cool and wasn't branded. And when people would show up to listen to him, he'd get on a boat and sail away and go pray by himself in a garden while everyone wanted to make him a king or make him famous.
Or what he said made them angry or uncomfortable.
Yeah. So I just, that's something that bothers me a lot. And I think it gets to that question of, we have a culture of church members who would prefer a narcissist leading a church. It's because we love narcissists. Those are the people we love to fawn over and to make famous and put up on our wall at the house. And they're the boy bands, they're the political leader, they're the famous whoever. That we love making people into celebrities, and we love following narcissists around and taking their advice on how we should live our life.
Yeah.
And that's our fault. That's on us. And we're killing a lot of churches that are not obsessed about brand because we are so obsessed with narcissist leaders.
Mm-hmm. And I think we flock that direction because it's the same deal as our relationship with like the government, where it's like we see a problem and we're like, somebody should do something about that.
And it's
and
never
we see
somebody
a narcissistic leader. We see someone who's really confident in themselves and their ability to solve the problem, or at least their ability to sell you on the lie that they can solve the problem, as long as you just give them your support. I mean, that's like the starting point of like cults and all of that. You know what I mean? Like that you look at one leader and you say, they convince you that they can solve all of the problems. If you would just be loyal to them, they can solve it. Mm-hmm. And we look at people that way. And then we wonder, like, how does this happen? How do we get to this point where this, like a church like Mars Hill, this happens? It's like, because you looked at this one person as if they could solve all of the problems. You let them convince you that they could solve all of the problems. And they may have even been convinced in their own mind that they could. They may have, honest to God, thought that they could solve all of the problems. Yeah. And so, like, you know, there's a section from 11:55 to 12:30 in episode 1 where the host, he outlines kind of like the vision that Mark had for this church. And it was, you know, the world is a corrupt place. Women and children are vulnerable. We need strong men to grow in faith and, you know, raise strong families. And that's how we're going to take over the city of Seattle. So that's like, to me, the question then is, how does that vision match up with the true gospel? Like, if that's their brand, how does that actually match up with what would Jesus think of that vision? Because the trick in that is, there's something to be said for, yes, there are young men need to be raised up to be strong, faithful husbands, loving fathers that are like co-rulers, creators, cultivators, warriors, like fight for the kingdom. 100%. That's the kernel of truth, right? Behind all of that. It's like that. Yes. And there is probably some truth behind some different reasons why that men are in churches typically quiet in the back. Either the ones on stage, or they're supposed to, you know, suppress their emotions and just sit there. And these like distorted views of masculinity in culture, like so there's something to be said for the kernel of truth that's there. But what's behind all of that is what Mark is telling people, what he convinced even probably himself and other people, was that it was going to be because of him. in his preaching and just him by himself and his leadership. They were going to look to Mark, and because these men were going to look at Mark, they were going to be able to be better fathers and husbands and citizens of the city.
I think what we need to really think about is, did Mark have any more or less ability to know God, to speak to God, for God to speak back than anyone else on planet Earth?
No.
I think the answer is no. But everyone in that hierarchy of that organization, and we do this in all kinds of places. If there's a pothole outside my house, I'm like, man, someone should fix that. I'm not talking about me.
Right.
Like, I'm always thinking about someone else. And when we do that, it's like, well, I've got spiritual problems. I don't know what to do with that. It's always someone, I need someone's help, and the someone isn't me. It's not me going to the word. It's not me, trying to pursue that wherever it takes me. It's trying to find a person that I think has breakfast with God every morning and get them to tell me what to do.
Because that's easier.
It's easier, and that's exactly what the Israelites did at the foot of Sinai. I love that part of the story.
Whole role.
Well, it's like we skipped over that a lot as a kid, but when they go to Sinai, God wanted to talk to all of the people. He said, bathe, get yourself ready, get yourself, prepared. And he starts talking to them, and it shakes them, and the rocks start shearing off the mountain, and they get so scared. They tell Moses to tell God to stop talking to them, because if he keeps talking to us, he'll kill us with his voice. Just his voice is too much for us. So instead, God, in his love and mercy and being willing to compromise, they send Moses up. And as we all know, as he's up there receiving the word of God, they're making another god out of gold at the base. We do that all the time. I don't understand why we think that any other person. It's because other people say, well, God told me this morning. You're like, okay, what does that mean exactly? But if we really take that hook, line, and sinker for a religious leader, we have the sense that they are in God's presence and God is talking to them. They have an open phone line with God that we don't. And it's not true. It's not actually what God wants at the end of the day. Is not for you to have a really connected to God pastor, which I hope your pastor is connected to God. I'm just saying that he wants every single person to be a prophet, a priest, and a royal priest in his kingdom. Like every single person to be an Adam and Eve, not just us give our money to Adam and Eve so they can be the people that God wants them to be.
Right.
And I think we should keep that real straight in our mind. And when it comes to, like you were saying, Mark saying that this is how we're going to take over Seattle, that's what I want to get to next, because the language there is what I had in my notes as well. Men should be warriors and defenders and protectors like Jesus and John the Baptist. It's like, I'll just say this. The first time that the word warrior shows up in the Bible, if I'm not mistaken, is referring to Nimrod, which we know is a Bugs Bunny quote, Nimrod. But way, way, way before Bugs Bunny, Nimrod was actually, he was like a Hercules. Like if you look at his story, he looks like what we think of as Greek Hercules, just a demagogue, ripped Samson type dude. And it says that he was a warrior. But what warrior means is someone who takes the life of another, someone who kills other humans. And you just heard right before this at the Noah story, before you hear Nimrod's name, if I'm not mistaken, that if you take a life of another human, it will be a life for a life and blood for blood. And so Nimrod's not a good character. He's not someone we're supposed to look up to. You just heard, if you take the life of an image bearer of God, your life will be taken from you. And then we hear about this guy who's a warrior, a life taker. And we read his story and we're like, wow, he seems really strong and violent, and he kills animals, and he's a great hunter. And you're like, okay. And that's exactly what that's what the whole point of the Marso podcast is that we hear what Nimrod is and we go, wow. What we're supposed to do is, wait, didn't God just tell me that that's not good?
Yeah.
And instead we just get mystified and we're like, whoa, wow, look at Nimrod. And instead we follow Nimrod to the grave. And it's terrible. And so somehow he relates warrior, defender, protector, like this violent kind of, yeah, let's be those guys, to Jesus and John the Baptist. And it's like, tell me where Jesus and John the Baptist were violent warrior, defender, protector people. Like, show me that story in the Bible. I dare you to. And I promise I'll have more scripture than whatever weak stuff you bring to the table. And this is what will happen if men truly respond to the gospel. You'll be a violent male. And I hate that false dichotomy of like, there are evil violent males out there in the world, so we need good violent males out there in the world.
Right.
Like, that is not
to protect women and children because they can't defend themselves.
You're like, what in the world? No, the women and children need to confront God too and have a personal relationship with God too, and not have, it's not their husbands and then their pastors and then God himself, no, it's all of us need to be in a direct relationship with God. We need to be standing at the base of Mount Sinai being like, I'm listening. And even if your voice scares me, and I think just your voice is going to kill me because it's so intense, I still need to be able to sit here, stand here in your presence and hear it for myself, and stop middlemaning all these other people into so much centralized power that they are corrupted and tempted to use that power against me. Yeah. No, like, we need to stop doing that and decentralize religion, in the sense of, you need to go to God. You need to be able to say, I don't know, Mark, I was talking to God at breakfast this morning and he didn't say that.
Right.
We need to all be having breakfast with God. And that's, in my stupid way of saying it. But yeah, being a violent defender of what you love is not a moral imperative. And I think Mark made it a moral imperative. If you're not doing this, then you don't love God, then you're sinning, then you're letting down the gospel, you're letting down the mission of the church. Tell me where Jesus said, if you're not violent about God, then you've morally failed.
Yeah.
And what verses are you working with? Because I don't see it.
Second Enoch.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Is there a false dichotomy between like a lazy man and a violent, hardworking man? If you're not being the violent good guy, he's just calling you lazy and a pansy and all this kind of stuff. You're right. Like, tell me, like, there is a third option, and it's Jesus.
Yeah.
He was not lazy, but he was not violent.
Right.
And you could say, okay, he tipped over tables in the temple and drove people out with whips. It's like, okay, but that brother went to the cross. He told Peter to put his sword down. Like, John the Baptist did not lead a violent revolution. He led people to the water. And so I just don't see that. And there is a distinct third option in this false, like, pick A or B, which you're going to be. It's like, it's not an A or B situation. There's a third way, and you're not pointing to that third way, and you're setting up a false dichotomy in front of people and saying, pick left or right, black or white.
Right. But if you're going to drive a vision, that's what you have to do. You have to make it look like there is no other option. You either have to listen to what Mark is saying, or you are a pansy. Yeah. And like, you're worthless and you don't love God. Like, that's what gets set up. And I think for us, like, we have to be careful of those same dichotomies we set up for people. And I think one of them that has been huge, that you hit on a bunch and that we've talked about a lot in this podcast, is just the devaluing of all humans and their role as priests, prophets, kings, queens. Like,
that's for all of us. And I
wish we
like
that was the intention. That was the intention from the beginning. And so for anyone to ever convince you that they have to be that for you, they're lying to you. That is not true. Even if they're 100% convinced that is the case, that is not the case whatsoever. Every human being is to be a priest that goes before God and at breakfast, I don't wake up early, so I would say a late night get together for me and God. We're doing like a late night by the bonfire type deal. But you know what I'm saying, like that was the intention from the beginning, was that we would all be priests and prophets. And so when it comes to a minister at a church, the issue is not we need to get rid of everyone who works in ministry as for a living. I think the question is how are we viewing those people, and how are those people viewing what they do? So for me personally, I don't think I have all the answers. What I'm trying to do is wake our students up to realize they don't need me. I'm discipling them. That's like discipleship assumes that I am working myself out of a job. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like discipleship assumes that I will not be needed. Like Jesus left after 3 years. He was gone. After he was resurrected, he didn't hang around to be like, I'm your like phone a friend, come to Nazareth, I'm hanging out with my mom. If you need anything, like while you're doing your thing, I'm always here. Like, let's keep having discipleship meetings. No, it's like, I'm out. I'm leaving it to you, and the Holy Spirit will be with you. And it's actually better that the Holy Spirit's with you, because that means, again, that you can communicate with me directly. You can come before me directly. You can come before God by the power of the Spirit through Jesus and know who God is and what he cares about. And there is no need for mediation. It's the whole thing. And so our role as ministers is, and for people who are church members, is less to say they have all the answers, let's look to them, but to say, like Matt, our preacher, we as a community find that it's really important for somebody to spend their week meditating on scripture and then bring us a thought. Truthfully, all of us should be doing that. That is our vocation. That's what we should be up to. And so then it becomes like, all right, Matt is very good at communicating these things. So we'll have him communicate some things to us, but we should be up to this all the time anyways. And then Sunday is not about Matt and what he can bring. It's about coming together to encourage and edify one another. And then to hear a word from God through one of our members of the community who's gone before God that week. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the whole thing. And
that's why I love the Quaker style worship, because that's what they do.
Right.
Like they literally don't have a plan. They have no programmed part of their service together. They all come in and pray in silence for 30 minutes.
But the problem with that, though, the problem with that is that it requires you to actually have a relationship with God.
Right. And that would fall
and to actually pursue it
apart in most of our churches.
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
We would just be like, oh, I'm supposed to do this. I thought some leader person was supposed to do all this work. No, we're all, and even with Israel was formed to be a nation of priests.
Yeah.
A whole nation of priests. So even when God's making a nation, he is still trying to get all those people to be priests in his nation, not just the Levites.
Right.
And so that's been in every project that God does. He's trying to make a decentralized for everyone. This is for all of you, not just that king or that high priest or that leader Moses or that prophet. It needs to be someone you need to be willing to be exactly in the yoke as everyone else is. And so
that's one thing that keeps coming up in this podcast. It's like, in my opinion, is one of the most damaging things that I wish that they would have brought up, like that the host would have brought up. But one of the most damaging things from Mars Hill and just American Christianity is the idea that every human being doesn't have value as a priest before God or a prophet before God, that they have to
because that would go take away from their power.
Right.
You need to come through me to the Father. And it's like, no.
But if you can convince people of that, you build a mega church and you keep yourself in work. and
Yeah,
making money for a long time. And I don't want to, I hope that there are lots of megachurch preachers. I want to assume the best. I hope that there's a lot of them that they just feel led and called to speak, and they speak more effectively, and they truthfully do go before God and receive words of like prophetic encouragement or challenge or critique or whatever. Like I want to believe that that's the case more times than not. But the reality is, I'm not asking that all the Mars Hills of America reduce from 15,000 to 100 people because you don't have that one person you follow. I'm saying, like, let's refocus our purpose in our time to say there are other things that we can be accomplishing, but we have this idea that we are all supposed to come and sit down and not put any effort forward during the week, other than maybe I'll read my Bible a few times, pray a few times. But I'm going to come on Sunday because that's where I'm going to get, like, I'm going to consume there, and that's going to power me for the rest of the week. And because I did that, like, I'm cool, I'm good, I'm baptized, I'm all good. I am nice to people and generous when people ask, and I do all of those things on the side. And I might throw in a Bible study during the week also that's a little bit better, where we are having some conversation. But I'm really just like, that Sunday morning is like, that's it. Like, I need to hear that, and I need to be led in that way. And I'm all for people being discipled. I think that's 100% needs to happen. But this idea that is the extent of what we do, that is the extent of our practice Christianity, is showing up on Sunday morning. Like, that is so
messed up.
bad. It's so bad, and it's creating more problems than we even know. Like, there are more problems being created that our children will have to deal with than you and I can even think about right now.
But it's stroking our egos, so we just keep going along with it. It's like, well, these people need me, so
right. But then we wonder why something like this happens with Marcel or other churches, or we wonder why we have ministers that you start laundering money, or
because they know
there's sexual abuse. There's sexual abuse that occurs under the radar because of different power structures. It's like, what do you mean why? What do you mean why is this happening? It's really not that complicated.
Because I believe that the human heart really isn't built for notoriety. Like, it's just corroding to the best of people, to all that notoriety. I think that's why Jesus spent so much time in prayer away from people, is because to really engage with that corrupting notoriety and people following you around and telling you're awesome, it's just corrupting to the soul. And so we do that to people who are not Jesus and don't take the time to readjust and get away and all that, or we don't live in church environments where that's even allowed. Mm-hmm. And we just tell someone, you got to preach every Sunday for the rest of your life. Go.
Right.
That's terrible. It's not gonna work. And so,
and just to expect that is gonna be healthy, and that every one of those is gonna be helpful, is just like, that's outrageous. Yeah.
So there was one point where he's preaching a sermon about, you need to be creators and cultivators. I'm like, okay, Mark, I'm a creator and a cultivator. What do you want to talk to me about? And he's like, yeah, you need to find a spouse, and you need to
cultivate the relationship.
You need to create that relationship. You need to cultivate that relationship, and you need to have kids. You need to create those kids, and you need to cultivate those kids and raise them to know God. And you need to, create a business and cultivate it and do it with integrity and all this stuff. I'm like, hey, I'm down with all that.
Yeah.
But then somehow the assumption is to create and cultivate assumes like you being, especially the men that are listening to it, being a violent, aggressive, and patriarchal dude that's like going to create and like cultivate is like twisting the dirt's arm and telling it what it's going to do, as opposed to like working with it to help it flourish.
Well, it's more like,
and you're like, I don't like the way you're talking about cultivation right now.
It's like, I want you to build an empire.
Yeah.
Like, that's the result of cultivation. that's the vibe I got. That was the word that kept coming in my head, is like he wants, like, basically he wants the church to take over Seattle, and how they're going to do that is they're going to basically like create these little empires. It sounded like super mafia type. Like, we're going to take over the city where everyone is like has to answer to us. And he doesn't say it like that, but he says take over the city. He talks about like, we're going to take over the city of Seattle. And I'm all for redeeming, like being good citizens of your city and like participating in the life of the city, and being like, for people to really feel a strong effect if your church was to disappear, that they would be like, man, that is a black hole. Like, we have lost a lot of support. But I'm all for that. But just the language, and really his vision was like, you're going to start businesses and ministries, and you're just going to like, everyone is going to have to answer to us, and we're just going to like throw down. We're going to like throw anyone under the bus that gets in our way. They're going to get run over, and we're just going to.
Yeah, so let's read that quote while you just use the
Do you
bus.
have it?
Yeah, so he's speaking to a group of other ministers at a conference where he was invited in as another leader. So he's not just a leader to his pastoring to pastors now, telling them how they should run their churches. And he said, I believe in bless and subtraction ministry. There's a pile of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus, and by the time we're done, by God's grace, it will be a mountain. You're either on the bus or get run over by the bus. Those are the options, but the bus ain't going to stop.
And the bus is Mars Hill, the vision of Mars Hill,
right?
Which
and you're like, is that really what Jesus is doing?
The conclusion they come to is the bus is really just Mark.
Right. And you're
Mark
just
is
like,
the bus.
Mark is the bus. And by the grace of God, it will be a mountain. Like,
mountain of dead bodies.
What is that? Like, who is saying those words? And I don't think that's Jesus at all. By the grace of God, there's not a mountain of dead bodies behind the church and what we're up to every day. That's outrageous.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of led to me writing, like, can we justify anything in the church as long as we can point to high numbers of baptisms, church attendance, giving, sermon downloads? Like, it literally is it doesn't matter how many bodies are in the mountain behind the bus, as long as we can point to baptism, church attendance, giving, sermon downloads. And it's like, okay, but are those the fruits of the Spirit? Are the fruits of the Spirit downloads and baptisms and church attendance and giving numbers? Like, those aren't the fruit of the Spirit.
Yep.
The fruit of the Spirit is self-control, which is being able to say enough. That's enough. And I don't think Mark knew how to say enough with the power he received, with the abundance he received through the giving he was receiving. I don't think he could say enough. And I don't think it's no surprise to me that in a culture like English, where it's like the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We don't even have a word for that in English. So we just had to smush two words together, self-control.
Yeah.
That in a culture with a language that doesn't even have a word for knowing when to say enough, that we would fail at that really bad. And it also says at the end of the fruits of the Spirit, against such things, there's no law. If you want to live in that world, it's a limitless world.
Yeah. Full freedom.
But you're like, but I want to live in the Spirit and outside of the Spirit. You're like, that's actually not freedom. Like, you will end up oppressing yourself. And as you can see with Mars Hill, they hurt a lot of people. And they said, but look at our fruit. Well, the fruit wasn't the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit was, look how many people have downloaded our podcast.
Right.
That's not the fruit of the Spirit. And they found that against such things, there is law. And the laws of nature took course on them and imploded their church. But if you live within the Spirit, there is no law. It's unlimited in that space. But we want to live in the Spirit and out of the Spirit. And we want to redefine what the Spirit's up to by numbers and baptism and all that stuff. And I'm not saying that any of those things are inherently bad, but it can't be the way that we define success.
I think that's a great way to close this episode. That's going to be something that comes up often. That idea of looking at the fruit, the ends and means, and all of that is going to be a part of this conversation constantly. But I think that's something for us to think about as we go forward. Like, what are we looking at as the fruit? Are we looking at the fruits of the Spirit, or are we looking at something else?
Right. So there's a few things I want to quote just to wrap that up. Diane Langberg at the end says, "We have ceased to think that our most important thing that we do is be like Christ, who serves the least of these." That's not what we've been doing. We've been garnering fame and numbers and money and alignment with secular powers that makes us look good and baptizing the whole darn thing. And I think that's so true. And that was something that they mentioned in the podcast as well, is that, Mark Driscoll and his crude and tasteless style of preaching and ministry helped prepare the whole evangelical church for the same style of leadership we saw in Donald Trump. And, it asked that question, how did the moral majority, these people are moral and righteous, and these people rally around a public adulterer? And why did people like John MacArthur, who's another megachurch pastor, have harsh criticism in 2016 against, someone like Donald Trump, and then in 2020 be like, yeah, look, you should vote for him? And I think it's because we've been garnering fame and numbers and money in alignment with secular powers that make us look good, and by baptizing the whole darn thing. I think in 2016 John MacArthur was bold enough to be like, hey, you shouldn't go for that guy. But when he saw his numbers and his giving and people pushing back against that, he saw that, well, if I want to keep my church and I want to keep my power, I have to go with the crowd on this one, because there's a mob saying you need to go this way. And the last thing I'll say is this is my last quote. After a long list of pastors that they listed and churches that have imploded, they just like rattle off a bunch of them. They even mentioned a pastor that took his own life after the strife that came from the church imploding. And this quote was says, ability rose all these people to prominence before their character was really ready for it. And we as a culture seem to be hook, line, and sinker for those types of leaders that have great abilities, yet they don't have the maturity to really live with integrity. And how can the church stop falling in love with celebrity pastors and doing damage to the pastors and the church? Like, both sides lose. Everyone loses. And so does the church's witness when the outside world sees us doing these things. But that stuck with me big time. Ability rose them to prominence before their character was ready for it. And I want to ask everyone out there, and I want to ask you, I want to ask me, like, if our ability has gotten us into a place of any kind of leadership in the church, have we really taken the time to form ourselves and our character and our integrity to receive that in a way that would honor Jesus and not just honor ourselves?
Yep. And I think that the whole idea of us all being priests, that there's some checks and balances there, that if your ability rises faster than your character, it's not all on you, because I'm also there and Rachel's also there, coming before God, and vulnerability and honesty and transparency can catch you and say, hey man, like, you're getting uneven here. We need to figure that out.
Right.
We're looking forward to more conversation about this podcast. As you can tell, it's full of all sorts of things to talk about. And man, it's sad, but it also is, I think, very timely and very relevant and exciting that we're getting to talk about this, because I think that a generation that hears this and listens to this and does something different is going to be a force for kingdom good. So we hope that this has been good for you. This is the podcast where we talk about Jubilee, freedom, and shalom all the time.
And
we love y'all, and we'll see you next week.
Shalom.